BetMGM, authorized gaming partner of the NBA, has your back all season long. Basketball fans can place live bets, create same-game parlays, take player props on their favorite players, and bet on the NBA championships. BetMGM.com for T's and C's. 18 plus to wager. Ontario only. Please play responsibly. If you have questions or concerns about your gambling or that of someone close to you, please contact Connects Ontario at 1-866-531-2600 to speak to an advisor free of charge. BetMGM operates pursuant to an operating agreement with iGaming Ontario.
The fire hose of news from America can feel like a lot these days.
If you're trying to figure out what to make of it all, we got you.
I'm Katie Simpson.
And I'm Paul Hunter. We're correspondents here in Washington,
working just around the corner from where much of the action is taking place.
2 blocks from the White House.
And that's the name of our new podcast.
For top-notch analysis of U.S. politics from a Canadian perspective, find 2 blocks from the White House every Wednesday wherever you get your podcasts,
including YouTube.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
A new report suggests Canada is on track to blow past all of its climate targets. The study by the Canadian Climate Institute suggests the 2030 Paris Agreement commitment, even the long-term goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050, are now firmly out of reach. Even the United States is cutting emissions faster than Canada, thanks to weakening more federal and provincial policies than this country has strengthened over the last year. I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with Ross Linden-Fraser, lead author of the study, about what went wrong and why Canada plays a bigger role than we realize in a warming planet. Ross, thanks so much for making the time to speak with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
According to your report, Canada is not on track to achieve any of its climate goals. Can you just remind us what those targets are and why you found that we're on track to blow past them all?
Yeah, absolutely. So our study is an independent assessment of a progress report that the federal government put out at the end of last year. This is something they're legally required to do. Canada adopted a law a couple of years ago that says the government needs to set targets, plan to meet them, and report on its progress. And at the Canadian Climate Institute, one of our goals is to provide an independent check on government efforts and to give them advice about how, among other things, they can correct course. So we did an independent assessment, and that's where we had this finding. Basically, what we did is we looked at different ways that Canada's climate policies might evolve over the next, coming months, depending on what decisions governments make. And yeah, we found that if policies continue on their current trajectory, or even if they're strengthened a little bit, Canada's not going to be on track to hit its near-term targets, and its emissions pathway is also not going to be aligned with our long-term goals of net zero emissions by 2050.
Yeah, can you just refresh our memories here? Remind us what those targets are.
Canada has 4 climate targets right now. It's got an interim target for 2026. It's got 2 milestone targets for 2030 and 2035, and it's got a long-term target for 2050. The 2030 target is the target we set under the Paris Agreement, and that's a goal to reduce our emissions by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels. The 2035 target is a little more ambitious. It's to cut emissions by 45 to 50%, and then the long-term goal is to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And that doesn't mean actually reducing our emissions to zero, but it means that any emissions that we do produce have to be compensated for somewhere else with removals, as they're called.
You mentioned your report is based on the federal government's own climate plan progress report. I guess, based on that federal report, what is currently the best case and worst case scenario that Canada is facing?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the scenarios we looked at and how those compare to the federal ones. So the federal government does 2 scenarios in its report. One is, what are today's measures doing? It's called with measures. And the other is, what if the government does everything that it has promised to do, which they call with additional measures. And if I have the numbers right in my head, the government says that with measures, we'll get just a little bit more than halfway to the 2030 target, around 23% reduction. And with all the additional measures, it says we could get to minus 28% by 2030. So, a little further than that. But one of the reasons we wanted to do our independent study is that the federal scenarios don't actually represent today's policies or the government's commitments. There is a funny little lag because by the time the federal government had put together its analysis, the federal policy had actually changed. Between Budget 2025 and the Canada-Alberta Memorandum of Understanding, the federal government has actually changed some of the things it's committing to doing. And then at the end of the year, it implemented some new climate policies. So what we tried to do in our analysis was capture some of those changes and also capture some of the uncertainty around federal policies, because I mentioned the Canada-Alberta Memorandum of Understanding. That agreement lays out a roadmap to strengthen some of Canada's climate policies, but it also leaves quite a bit of uncertainty. It's possible some policies will be suspended or replaced, and there is a lot yet to be negotiated that will decide the effectiveness of one policy, in particular, industrial carbon pricing.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about that because the Carney government, it's made several rollbacks when it comes to climate change policies, but it appears to be doubling down on industrial carbon pricing. And I just wonder, is that enough?
It's an important step, but is it enough to hit our targets? No, it's not. That doesn't mean that we should set aside the government's efforts to strengthen industrial carbon pricing. Our analysis, and actually more recent analysis that the federal government has done, shows that of all of Canada's climate policies, industrial carbon pricing is going to make by far the greatest impact on reducing our emissions. The federal government estimates, our report estimates that industrial carbon pricing could deliver as much as around 40% of the reductions of all of Canada's climate policies if it's done right. So industrial carbon pricing is really important, and we can talk a bit about some of the details that we think the government needs to get right in fixing those systems, because right now they're important, but they're not fulfilling their full potential. The other thing you asked is industrial carbon pricing enough? And the answer is no. Our report suggests that Canada's climate policies, even if they get all the details right, will still achieve a little bit less than what the federal government projected in its analysis. Our range was around an 18 to 22% reduction compared to 2005 levels. So just a little short of, to just a little more than halfway to the target. And even if you strengthen industrial carbon pricing, you're only going to get to the top end of that range, which is still a long way off the targets. Doesn't mean strengthening industrial carbon pricing is not important, but is it enough? No.
So what you're saying essentially is that even if everything is implemented to the fullest extent, it still would not be possible to meet Canada's targets if we continue on the path that we're currently on. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, that's right. And that was one of our critiques of the federal report, because one of the things the federal government is supposed to do in these progress reports is, if its projections show that Canada is going to miss a target, the government's supposed to say, here are some ways we could correct course, here are some options. The law doesn't force the government to do anything, but it does say the government should consider ways it could correct course. And we didn't really see that in the federal report. The federal report, if you read it, makes it clear that even if everything goes the way the federal government is planning, they're still going to be far off their targets. And we were a little disappointed that there wasn't a more substantive assessment of options to correct course. That's one of the reasons why, in our report, we outlined a series of things we think the federal government can do to begin to bend that trajectory back toward our net zero target. Our report is not about hitting the 2030 target at all costs. It's not about everything the government should do to get to those near-term targets. We recognize there's a lot of things going on right now, and there are a lot of challenging considerations governments are trying to balance. But there is a serious risk if we stay wildly off course for our climate targets, and that's why we made some suggestions about how to get a little closer to on track.
Yeah, can we talk a bit about the suggestions that you made in the report and how you estimate Canada can correct course?
So we talked a bunch about industrial carbon pricing, and that's where the recommendations begin, because it is the single most important policy. And it doesn't just matter for emissions reductions. There's a really important competitiveness angle to industrial carbon pricing. We're all talking about how to diversify trade right now, and some of our largest trading partners outside of the United States not only have industrial carbon pricing, but are beginning to adopt border carbon tariffs that will penalize exporters that didn't pay a carbon price. So in that way, the industrial carbon pricing system doesn't just help industries get ahead of the curve, but it also protects some of them from potential export tariffs as we try to diversify our economy. So what should governments do about industrial carbon pricing? Canada and Alberta laid out one route in the MOU that they signed, which is that we're going to try to get what are called credit prices up to $130 a ton. We're all familiar with the carbon price itself. Right now, it's $95 a ton. In the past, it was expected to go to $170 a ton by 2030. The MOU suggests that maybe the federal government is willing to compromise on that. But the MOU is not actually about the carbon price. It's about the credit price. And right now, those prices, the prices that facilities are paying to obtain the credits that they generate, are way lower than they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be pretty close to the carbon price. But in practice in Alberta, credit prices are, $20, $30, $40 instead of $85, $95. And to hit that, you're going to have to tighten up the systems. You're going to have to tighten the emissions thresholds that decide when facilities begin to pay the carbon price. You're also going to need to change some strange loopholes that have been introduced. Both Alberta and Ontario have introduced a kind of strange loophole where if you're a facility and you invest in your own facility, you might get credit for that and avoid the carbon price. So there's some strange things that, strange rules that probably should get taken out of the systems to make them more effective. Doing that's the most important thing. I'll mention a couple other recommendations in our report. One is that there's a model of cooperation that we think could work quite well, not just for carbon pricing, but for other policies. So the way carbon pricing works, the way methane regulations work, is that the federal government sets minimum standards, and then basically it gives the provinces the flexibility to come up with their own solutions. That's why Alberta has its own carbon pricing system. It's why BC and Saskatchewan and Alberta have local methane regulations for oil and gas. And our analysis suggests that those policies, the ones following that model, are by far and away the most important ones for reducing emissions. So if governments can stick to that as an approach in their existing policies or new ones, we think that'll help get closer to our goals. But the crucial thing is that the federal government has to be willing to enforce those minimum standards, and the provinces have to come up with equivalents that are genuinely equivalent. And the last thing that I'll mention from our report is a whole other category of policies. One of the changes we've seen in the last couple of years is that governments have not only weakened or removed some of their climate policies, which is one of the reasons we're not on track, but they've also refocused them. They've narrowed their scope. We have fewer policies that are trying to reduce emissions across the economy and more that are just focused on industry. And industry matters, but it's not enough. And it's not just for the sake of emissions reductions that we care about climate policies. Climate policies are also really important for competitiveness and affordability. It's one of the reasons we were happy to see the federal government reintroducing subsidies for purchasing electric vehicles. By now, it's clear that electric vehicles and heat pumps are some of the future of consumer technology, but we also know that they're expensive. And so our report recommends some of the other targeted supports that we think governments should roll out to help people access these clean technologies and put them to use in their own lives.
Are we exposed? Security teams ask this every day. Vulnerabilities across network, cloud, AI, and OT silos hide the truth, and attackers are watching. Tenable unifies your tools, teams, and data so you can spot and close risks fast. Tenable's AI-powered exposure management gives teams one view of risk, helping them focus, take action, and close critical exposures fast. Visit Tenable.com. Tenable. Your exposure ends here.
I did want to ask you, and you've alluded to it a bit in your answer there, is just how much of this falls on the shoulders of provincial governments, because it's not, the onus is not entirely on Ottawa.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. One of the things we try to do in this report, even though it's about a federal report, is to emphasize the importance of other jurisdictions stepping up. Provinces have some of the most important tools in the fight against climate change. They're responsible for building codes. They run local electricity systems. They have a bunch of fiscal firepower of their own that they can use for subsidies. It was a little disappointing, the federal government reintroduced electric vehicle subsidies, and BC announced that because the federal government had done that, it was going to cancel its own. So there are ways that we would like to see provincial governments stepping up. One is to fix those industrial carbon pricing systems. The federal government has set minimum standards and it needs to enforce them, but provinces operate most of the systems in the country, and so they need to get the details right. The federal government can't make them. Next thing is on electricity policy. We've seen some more interest in building out clean electricity at the provincial level. Hydro-Quebec has a big plan. BC's, moving ahead with some really big procurements. But our deployment of clean electricity is still woefully small. I was looking at a statistic recently. In the last 9 months, the state of Texas has deployed 126 times more wind and solar than all of Canada did in the past year. Now, we have other resources. We have hydro, we have nuclear. There are other things. There are other clean electricity sources we can rely on, but provinces and utilities really need to step up in expanding clean electricity supply. And then that last piece is, affordability. Provinces should also be helping their citizens to access clean technologies. And we'd like to see more measures at the provincial level too.
That stat is quite surprising. I personally hadn't seen that. But I wonder, how does Canada compare to other countries, other jurisdictions in terms of making progress?
Not super well. We took a look last year at the progress Canada has made compared to G7 countries and some of our peers in the OECD, which are, developed wealthy countries. In the G7, we're dead last. We have made less progress reducing our emissions compared to every other country, including the United States. And, you can debate Canada's relative emissions and the contribution we make. It's true that Canada's emissions are a lot lower than China's. China's got 20 times our emissions. But Canada is still the 10th or 11th largest emitter in the world, depending on how you measure it. And what we do matters diplomatically, morally, and scientifically. And so the fact that we're dead last in the G7 suggests that we're really not pulling our weight. When you look at our peers, the story is much the same. There are some wealthy countries that are underperforming, like South Korea, which has a pretty dirty electricity grid. But by and large, if you look at our peers, we are not making enough progress.
And yet the Prime Minister has time and time again insisted that, his government is still driving forward on reducing emissions, despite scrapping some Trudeau-era policies. I mean, he has continued to call his government a leader on climate change. Is that not true?
I don't want to suggest that Canada is not making any progress. And I also don't want to suggest that we've seen no positive movement. Canada has made less progress than some of its peers, but our emissions have come down slightly, just not enough. Emissions right now are about 9% below 2005 levels, so far short of the pace we need, but it is a reduction. And we've also seen some positive movements from this government on climate policy. It's true that the federal government has removed several climate policies. Some of the more egregious weakening of climate policies has really taken place at the provincial level. But it's true the federal government has scrapped several important policies like the carbon tax, the fuel charge. So there is a mixed story here. What I think we're looking for from the federal government is more efforts like what we saw at the end of 2025. At the end of 2025, the federal government announced two really impactful climate policies that it was proceeding with. One of those is methane regulations for the oil and gas sector, and another was methane regulations for landfills. The first is important because if there is any positive story to be had about oil and gas emissions, it's that the sector has been reducing its methane emissions, and the federal government has been cooperating with the provinces to make those policies work. So we're really glad to see those regulations. And the landfill regulations are good because, like I mentioned earlier, there's a big focus on industrial emissions, and so to the extent that we can get policies covering emissions elsewhere in the economy, that's a really good sign. The key steps we want to see the federal government take are follow through on some of its commitments from the federal budget and the MOU. The MOU made it clear that the federal government's going to try to fix industrial carbon pricing, and we're hoping to see some announcements in the coming months showing that they're going to do that. We want to see the federal government enforce the minimum standards it sets for different policies. That includes carbon pricing, that includes methane regulations, and that also includes the clean electricity regulations, which the federal government has suggested it may start negotiating with the provinces. The one thing we want to see avoided is compromises on federal minimum standards. The federal government has the right to set these minimum standards. It has, goals to achieve. And if it negotiates away the standards it has set, it's going to be harder for us to get closer to our goals.
When we look through the lens of policy, your report wouldn't necessarily have factored in the new auto strategy because that was just too recent.
Yeah, that's right. I'm happy to talk a bit about the auto strategy.
I'd love to know if you think it'll move the needle at all.
The auto strategy, I should start by saying that we haven't crunched the numbers. And I don't want to speculate too much. We thought the automotive strategy was a measured step in the right direction. So to recap what's in the big climate measures that are in the auto strategy, the federal government has decided that it's going to cancel the mandatory EV sales mandate, the availability standard, and replace that with stronger emissions regulations for passenger vehicles. And the other thing it's going to do is reintroduce a short-lived subsidy to help people purchase non-emitting vehicles. I think I mentioned earlier, we're happy to see the subsidies. We think people need help accessing clean technologies. So that's great. That's all positive. The replacement of the EV availability standard with these tighter emissions regulations is another nuanced story. It is going to mean fewer emissions reductions. Tighter vehicle emissions regulations are a good thing. We have those regulations now, but they're not going to be as stringent. And the federal government's acknowledged that. It's said that what it's aiming to do is get regulations that would be equivalent to around 90% EV sales by 2040. The old regulation was aiming for 100% EV sales by 2035. When we did our analysis, we knew this policy was up in the air, so we looked at a couple of scenarios. We looked at what happens if the federal government scraps the EV mandate completely? What if it delays it a little bit? What if it keeps it as it is? And any delay or scrapping of the mandate would mean fewer emissions reductions. So I think we can be pretty confident saying that this new policy is not going to be as effective at reducing emissions. The question is it going to do other things? Is it going to give automakers some more breathing space to adapt to a changing market? One thing it's definitely going to do is help our auto standards keep up, because the Trump administration is weakening its vehicle emissions regulations, which have in the past always been aligned with ours. So now we're moving a little closer to what the European Union is doing, and that's a good thing. Now, all of this means, as I said, it's a measured step in the right direction. We are focusing a little bit less on emissions reductions with this automotive strategy, but we're seeing some serious signals that the government is thinking about the future of the auto sector, and it's thinking about affordability, and that's positive.
Ross, a study published earlier this month by a group of scientists warned that the Earth is nearing a hothouse Earth trajectory. You mentioned earlier that Canada ranks the lowest among its G7 peers in terms of progress being made on emissions. And I just wonder, based on that report, what responsibility Canada would bear in that?
It's clear that the impacts of climate change are accelerating in Canada. They're real and they're affecting this country. Last year, the UN put out a report saying that we're heading for between around 2.5 and close to 3 degrees of warming globally by the end of the century, depending on what happens with climate policies. And we know that Canada has already warmed by about 1.7 degrees on average since the end of World War II, when we started national record keeping. And in the north, it's even higher. It's 2.3 degrees in the north. So we know that the world is warming. It's going to warm more. We know that Canada has already warmed substantially, and it's going to warm faster than the rest of the world because the globe heats up more toward the poles. And we're seeing real impacts from that warming that I mentioned. We know that extreme weather events are becoming more intense. The wildfire damage we saw a couple of years ago covered 6 times the area of the historical average. Between 2018 and 2022, crop insurance payouts from, mostly because of drought, increased by about 5.5 times. The wildfires that we're seeing are costing enormous sums of money in healthcare damages. We did an estimate about what the wildfires of 2023 might have cost the Ontario healthcare system, and it was more than $1 billion. So we know that climate change is happening. We know it's expensive. We know that we're on track for more of it. And Canada alone cannot stop climate change. And, the climate change we see here in Canada is not just a result of Canada's efforts. But like I said earlier, we're a big emitter. We're a historically large emitter, 10th or 11th in the world, second if you measure us in per capita terms. And so I think we have a pretty indisputable moral obligation to do something. And I think we all know what a collective action problem is. We all know that if you and your neighbor both have to do something and your neighbor's not doing anything, you're less likely to. So the less that Canada, one of the wealthiest, most educated, most capable countries in the world, does to fight climate change, the harder it's going to be for the whole world to get together and avoid the worst impacts. So what we do does not decide everything, but it does matter.
Ross, I will leave it on that note. Really appreciate your insight today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And that was The Big Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation. Send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can reach us on Instagram at FrequencyPods or on Blue Sky at The Big Story. If you know someone who might enjoy this episode, please send it to them. You can also listen to The Big Story every day on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thanks so much for listening.